Hello viewers, I am Mrs. Revati from St. Anne's College. Today I am here to deal with the lesson, The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. Kate Chopin is also known as Catherine O'Flaherty. The Story of an Hour actively searched for female spiritual emancipation, which she found and expressed in her writing. Her poems, short stories and novels allowed her not only to assert her beliefs for herself, but also to question the ideas of individuality and autonomy during the turn of the century. Unlike many of the feminist writers of her time who were mainly interested in improving the social conditions of women, she looked for an understanding of personal freedom that questioned conventional demands of both men and women. Additionally, she did not limit her exploration of freedom to physical emancipation only, that is, husbands controlling wives through the traditional expectations of motherhood, but also intellectual autonomy, that is, women having political opinions taken seriously. Kate's writings provided her with the means to live how she wanted, both mentally and physically, rather than play the role society expected of her. She did not start her professional writing career until later in life, but the lessons learned and the events experienced gave her the unique insight that provided material for her stories. Well, Catherine O'Flaherty was born on February 8, 1850 in St. Louis, Missouri, to Eliza Ferris O'Flaherty, a well-connected Louisiana woman with French roots, and Captain Thomas O'Flaherty, a businessman from Ireland. Her father became one of the first influences in her life. He found her natural curiosity fascinating and encouraged her interests. On November 1, 1855, Kate's father was killed in train accident. Because of his premature death, three strong maternal figures raised Kate, her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Kate's educated great-grandmother taught through the art of storytelling, which is how Kate learned to be a successful storyteller. Through vivid French stories, she gave Kate a taste of the culture and freedom allowed by the French that many Americans during this time disapproved of. Many of the common themes in her grandmother's stories consisted of women struggling with morality, freedom, convention, and desire. The spirit of these stories endures in Kate's own works. During Kate's teenage years, the Civil War raged on, separating the North and the South. Her family sided with the South, but most of her hometown of St. Louis supported the North. The loss of loved ones and fragility of peace taught her that life was precious and needed to be treasured. Her great-grandmother died in 1863 at the age of 83, and a month later, Kate's adored half-brother George O'Flaherty, a 23-year-old Confederate soldier, died of typhoid fever. One of Kate's teachers, a sacred nun, Mary Philomena, encouraged her to write. Writing helped Kate express her sense of humor and resolve her painful feelings of war and death. Teachers and classmates soon recognized her talent of being a gifted storyteller. At age 18, Kate graduated from the academy and made her social debut. Although she preferred to spend time alone reading instead of attending socials all night, Kate was a natural conversationalist. She followed the traditional custom of debuting, but she wanted to escape from the parties and the social expectations. On June 9, 1870, Kate married Oscar Chopin and moved to New Orleans. is known is that her marriage to Oscar was not antithesis of what she demanded out of life. She did not sacrifice her spiritual freedom by marrying him and continued to violate all the rules of expected female behavior. She rolled and smoked, her clothes were flashy and stylish, yet always memorable and pretty. After moving to Louisiana in 1879, she rode horses in addition to taking walks, but if she was in a hurry, she had a reputation of jumping on her horse and galloping away. She did what she wanted to do and refused to conform to tradition for tradition's sake. Kate and Oscar had 6 children within the first 10 years of their marriage. Kate allowed their children as much freedom as possible and permitted them to enjoy their youth with playing music and dancing. Although Kate loved her children, motherhood often consumed her, so she traveled to familiar places such as St. Louis and the Grand Isle as much as possible. Her children came with her since family and friends would be available to watch them. Oscar Chopin died on December 10, 1882. Oscar had left Kate with a failing business and 6 small children to raise. She ran the store, paid off the debt, and managed the property for 2 years before moving back to St. Louis to live closer to her mother and to provide better education opportunities for her children. Her mother died a year after Kate returned to St. Louis. Her mother's death affected her the most. She had barely recovered from Oscar's sudden death, only to face her mother's sudden death. As a result, she was reintroduced to one of her favorite childhood activities, writing. After the death of her mother, she was encouraged by one of her family doctor to start writing again because he recognized the eloquence in her letters and encouraged her. She published her first short story, A Point at Issue, in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on October 27, 1889. And a few months later, Philadelphia Musical Journal published Wiser Than God, her first novel. At Fault is published in September 1890 at her own expense. Around this time, she became a charter member of the Wednesday Club, which was founded by Charlotte Stearns Eliot. Kate did not write much afterwards because no one would buy her stories. Her last published story was Polly in 1902. 2 years later, Kate collapses at the St. Louis World's Fair and dies 2 days later from complications of a stroke. And this was all about the author Kate Chopin. Let us now move on to the summary of the text, the story of an hour. The story of an hour. Here we go with the summary. The story of an hour is a short story centering on a young married woman of the late 19th century as she reacts to a report that her husband has died in a train accident. Society in late 19th century expected women to keep house, cook, bear and rear children. Despite efforts of women's activists such as Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, women still had not received the right to vote in national elections by the century's end. Moreover, employers generally discriminated against women by hiring them for menial jobs only and paying them less than men for the same work. The story of an hour hints that Mrs. Mallard's husband, perhaps a typical husband of his day, dominated his wife. Now, this particular story, the story of an hour, very much observes the classical unities. Let me give you a hint on what classical unities are. This is something where the action takes place in a single hour in an American home in the last decade of the 19th century. The story observes the classical unities of time, place and action. These unities dictate that the events in a short story should take place in a single day and in a single location as part of a single story with no subplots. Let me introduce you to the characters of this story. Lois Mallard, the protagonist of the story, her husband Brentley Mallard and his friend Mr. Richard, and Lois Mallard's sister Josephine. An intelligent, independent woman, Lois Mallard, understands the right way for women to behave, but her internal thoughts and feelings are anything but correct. When her sister announces that Brentley has died, Lois cries dramatically rather than feeling numb, as she knows many other women would. Her violent reaction immediately shows that she is an emotional, demonstrative woman. She knows that she should grieve for Brentley and fear for her own future, but instead she feels elation at her newfound independence. Lois is not cruel and knows that she'll cry over Brentley's dead body when the time comes. But when she is out of others' sight, her private thoughts are of her own life and the opportunities that await her, which she feels have just brightened considerably. Lois suffers from a heart problem, which indicates the extent to which she feels that marriage has oppressed her. The vague label Chopin gives to Lois' problem, heart trouble, suggests that this trouble is both physical and emotional. A problem, the vague label Chopin gives to Lois' problem, heart trouble, suggests that this trouble is both physical and emotional, a problem both within her body and with her relationship to Brentley. In the hour during which Lois believes Brentley is dead, her heart beats strongly. Indeed, Lois feels her new independence physically. Alone in her room, her heart races and her whole body feels warm. She spreads her arms open, symbolically welcoming her new life, body and soul free. She repeats to herself a statement that shows how total her new independence really is for her. In the story of an hour, independence is a forbidden pleasure that can be imagined only privately. When Lois hears from Josephine and Richards of Brentley's death, she reacts with obvious grief, and although her reaction is perhaps more violent than other women's, it is an appropriate one. Alone, however, Lois begins to realize that she is now an independent woman, a realization that enlivens and excites her. Even though these are her private thoughts, she at first tries to squelch the joy she feels to beat it back with her will. Such resistance reveals how forbidden this pleasure really is. When she finally does acknowledge the joy, she feels possessed by it and must abandon herself to it as the word free escapes her lips. She sees her life as being absolutely hers and her new independence as the core of her being. Overwhelmed, Lois even turns to prayer, this hoping for a long life in which to enjoy this feeling. When Brentley returns, he unwittingly yanks Lois independence away from her, putting it once again out of her reach. The forbidden joy disappears as quickly as it came, but the taste of it is enough to kill her. Through this story, Chopin tries to suggest that all marriages, even the kindest ones, are inherently oppressive. Lois, who readily admits that her husband was kind and loving, nonetheless feels joy when she believes that he has died. Her reaction doesn't suggest any malice, and Lois knows that she'll cry at Bentley's funeral. However, despite the love between husband and wife, Lois views Bentley's death as a release from oppression. She never names a specific way in which Bentley oppressed her, hinting instead that marriage in general stifles both women and men. She even seems to suggest that she oppressed Bentley just as much he oppressed her. This is the story of a woman who finds out her husband has died in a train wreck. She reacts with sadness at first, but then realizes in a rush of emotion and relief that she is free body and soul free. She views the world with a fresh outlook, one where she will be her own person, answering only to herself. The new day outside has completely absorbed the attention of Mrs. Mallard, and while she still sobs occasionally, as a child who has cried itself to sleep and continues to sob in its dreams, she is nonetheless completely taken with the outside world. She is finally described by the narrator of Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin as being young with a fair, calm face, and the reader imagines her sitting. The plot of Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin is clearly shifting as Mrs. Mallard suddenly realizes what is troubling and begins to whisper the words, "Free, free, free." As she sees that her life can be her own now. Kate Chopin, the narrator, says that at this moment she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome, as it becomes clear that her husband, who she only loved sometimes, is gone, and her life is hers season after season. The heart trouble that afflicts Lois is both a physical and symbolic malady that represents her ambivalence toward her marriage and unhappiness with her lack of freedom. The fact that Lois has heart trouble is the first thing we learn about her, and this heart trouble is what seems to make the announcement of Bentley's death so threatening. A person with a weak heart, after all, would not deal well with such news. When Lois reflects on her new independence, her heart races, pumping blood through her veins. When she dies, at the end of the story, the diagnosis of heart disease seems appropriate because the shock of seeing Bentley was surely enough to kill her. But the doctor's conclusion that she died of overwhelming joy is ironic because it had been the loss of joy that had actually killed her. Indeed, Lois seems to have died of a broken heart caused by the sudden loss of her much loved independence. The open window from which Lois gazes for much of the story represents the freedom and opportunities that await her after her husband has died. From the window, Lois sees the blue sky, fluffy clouds and treetops. She hears people and birds singing and smells a coming rainstorm. Everything that she experiences through her senses suggests joy and spring, new life, and when she ponders the sky, she feels the first hints of elation. Once she fully indulges in this excitement, she feels that the open window is providing her with life itself. Let me tell you the final, or give you a brief summary of the lesson, The Story of an Hour. The short story describes the series of emotions Louise Mallard endures after hearing the death of her husband, who was believed to have died in a railroad disaster. Mrs. Mallard suffers from heart problems, and therefore her sister attempts to inform her of the horrific news in a gentle way. Mrs. Mallard locks herself in her room to immediately mourn the loss of her husband. However, she begins to feel an unexpected sense of exhilaration. Free body and soul free is what she believes is a benefit of his death. At the end of the story, it is made known that her husband was not involved in the railroad disaster, and upon his return home, Mrs. Mallard suddenly dies. The cause of her death is ambiguous and left for analysis. We can ask ourselves if the real reason for the death knew that she wouldn't be free after she sees that her husband isn't really dead. The theme of this story is the irony. The irony of Mrs. Mallard on seeing her husband, which causes her death. In fact, being a heart patient could receive the news of the tragedy in a comfortable way, but her husband, on seeing her husband back, which is the real cause of her death, this is nothing but an irony. What is irony here? Let me just tell you a little about this. You expect something, but comes out, or the product or the outcome is something different, which is nothing but irony. And this is how Mrs. Mallard dies at the end of the story, as her newfound joy did not last long. On seeing her husband Bentley Mallard's return, she collapses, and the other members of her family thinks that she died because of the joy that kills on seeing her husband. But the true factor is not because of the joy that actually killed her, because of the fear of losing her freedom, that which actually caused her death. Thank you.